Alright, hey Peyton, this is Eric, recording this again. It's my first, recording this again. First time wasn't very loud apparently, so I'm gonna go for it again. Let's talk about morality. There's only one real basis for morality, I would argue, and that is morality. The basis for morality is the well-being of conscious creatures. Even divine theory ultimately must come down to this. When you ask the question, what is really good or really bad about suffering in heaven, about being in heaven or suffering in hell for eternity, the question, it ultimately must come down to the suffering of those conscious creatures for eternity or their happiness for eternity, which, it doesn't come just from God says so. That has some value to people, and so any morality you try to argue will ultimately come down to any morality you argue will ultimately come down to the well-being of conscious creatures. So, how about your viewpoint that free will changes morality? Well, I would argue that it doesn't. So let's look at the situation and talk about punishment. The way you're describing punishment is in a way that makes it seem like it's for revenge, or that it's moral to hurt those who hurt others, and that we need to do that because they've hurt other people and they deserve it somehow. They deserve it. They're culpable. However, if you're trying to maximize the well-being of conscious creatures, the only thing you need to be doing from that criminal is trying to protect the well-being of other conscious creatures from him. And so that might mean prison. That might mean, at a time that might have meant death because imprisoning someone for that long was impossible. Or that could mean if we had a pill to change people from being evil to good, we can give them that pill and change them, right? And there'd be no need for a punishment. So in that way, so in the way you talk about even free will doesn't make punishment moral. It's still immoral, and free will has nothing to say on that matter. It never did. It might have been a really easy model for people, because in the way they experience their lives, that's the way that makes the most sense. If you want to follow it, that's the easiest way to do it is by thinking in those terms. But when you look at what was the reason behind imprisonment or people behind criminal law, and in the government, what is the motivation behind it? The motivation has always been to protect the public. And so, and I'm not going to say in every country all over the world it's always been there, but for the most part, the reason we punish criminals is to protect the innocent. And it works as a social structure because people follow incentives. Which brings me to your next point about microeconomics. The way you talk about decisions, I think you were, at first I thought you were talking about that free will itself directly affects economics, but some of the other stuff you're talking about makes it sound like you're trying to say that thought and rationality, though they can exist within an individual, don't really affect people's decisions. That people make their decisions based on instincts before thinking, rather than saying that they didn't have the free will to begin with. I think it's kind of odd because under my materialist viewpoint, you don't have any free will in the sense that none of your thoughts are your free will. That what you think is determined is that those are just brain chemicals in your brain, and you had no choice in the matter of which chemicals came up. And so you had no free will in the sense that you couldn't have you would have been unable to make any other decision because the way you thought of, because up to this point now, every single thought you must have thought in the exact way that you thought it, because you didn't choose any of those things. And so that's what I don't mean that you can't that you're that um, that it's only instincts or anything. That it's just that everything is determined, including your thoughts, and that your thoughts do determine your actions. Um, so this is related to microeconomics. Is that there might people do make some decisions based on instincts, and your analysis on saying that there are some people do make decisions before they know it, but that doesn't mean that all decisions are made before the person knows it, and that's the only way that thoughts occur. That just means that in this study, for this one particular type of thought, that thought occurred before the person was aware of it. And in a way, all thoughts are that way, sure, but not all decisions are made based on the first instinct in that way. That's only some type of decisions and some types of thoughts. Um, so and the way you can know that is because these experiments are only done on one particular type of thought. So it's obvious that you can't generalize that to all to all variety of human thought. Which, just based on the way the experiments are designed, you should be able to see that. As for economics never required the assumption that people behave rationally. Economics never economists never use that assumption. Although it's although they make an assumption that sounds very similar to that. In fact, I want to add something I didn't put in the last one, but I want to add here that one thing that annoys me about arguing economics is that in this study of economics, we use words that people use a lot in their daily life and they use elsewhere. But in this field of economics, we mean very specific things. And so when you come in and assume common language when talking economics, it leads to a lot of analysis errors, and that's kind of annoying, like here. So what economists assume is not that individuals behave rationally, but that statistical populations of people behave in a way that can be modeled as if the individuals were reacting to incentives. You know, that's it. Actually, just if they're reacting to incentives in a predictable way, or at least patterned way. And so economists don't need to assume any individual actors rationally, and they never do. They just assume populations do. And you can make that assumption. Like you don't need. I'm sure you can see how that would make a difference. Same with like evolution. When you're talking about a non-random process. A random process that's non-randomly selected. So economics never required rationality nor free will or any of that stuff. Let's talk about neuroscience or psychology. Maybe those fields require free will, or maybe those fields would change if they knew that there's no such thing as free will. Well, the answer, well, not really. Neuroscience already somewhat directly assumes that free will doesn't exist. When it tries to study what the effect of a firing in this type of firing in the brain means in causes to consciousness, they're assuming that like your consciousness happened because of your chemical reactions, which you didn't choose, right? Like they're assuming that the contents of your mind is coming from neurons, and that they're studying what the effects of those neurons are. They're already, that's already kind of necessary for there not to be free will in order to study neuroscience. If there was free will, then it wouldn't matter what the neurons do, in a way, because or at least you'd have to be choosing the neurons here at free will, or you have to be assuming that there's some non-physical material or something. It'd be something spooky would have to be in there to make that work. And then psychology doesn't really contradict neuroscience in that way. Um, it kind of, the way they talk about the way your past affects you and the way psychology seems to work, seems to assume that um, people behave similarly. A lot of the studies somewhat implicitly assume um, that your brain that it's just your brain that is at the heart of everything, at the heart of your decisions and at the heart of everything psychology related. So I don't see how free will is necessary there either. Um, yeah. So um, yeah, free will and determinism are compatible with all those sciences as the way they are done today. There's no need to change economics, morality, science based on the knowledge of whether free will exists or not.